the radiation counters on the armor of the Sextane. Legion clicked like dying insects. They stood amidst the glass ruins of the American scrublands. The wind howled, carrying dust that glowed with isotopic decay. This was the end of the Unification Wars. The Emperor's armies had broken the last of the techno-barbarian warlords on Terra. Now the victors sifted through the ashes. The target was a specific vault buried beneath the salt flats. It was a relic from a time before the Age of Strife. It was a prison and a preservation chamber. The gene-enhanced warriors moved slabs of concrete that weighed as much as a tank. They worked without speaking. Their discipline was absolute. They were not here to loot. They were here to retrieve an asset. The heavy lead doors groaned open. Stale air from thousands of years ago rushed out to meet the poisoned atmosphere of the 30th millennium. Inside the chamber, the lights flickered to life. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls. Most had failed centuries ago. The occupants inside were nothing but dried bone and dust. Only one pod hummed with active power. The bio readings on the console showed a stable heart rate. A figure in simple grey robes stepped past the massive space marines. He carried a staff topped with a golden eagle. This was Malcador the Sigillite. He tapped the release sequence on the glass. He did not hesitate. He had spent decades hunting for this specific mind. Steam vented from the hydraulics. The lid of the pod lifted. Robert Oppenheimer gasped as his lung filled with the air of a ruined world. He fell forward onto the metal grating. His body was weak from the suspension fields. He looked up. He saw the giants standing in a circle around him. They looked like statues of war-made flesh. Their faces were hard and scarred. They held weapons that looked like industrial tools of slaughter. Oppenheimer looked at the Sigillite. He saw a man who looked as old as history itself. Malcador offered him a flask of water. It was the first mercy Oppenheimer had seen. The physicist asked where he was. Malcador told him the truth. He told him that the year was no longer relevant. He told him that the nations of his birth were gone. He told him that the atmosphere outside was toxic, and that humanity was fighting a war for survival that spanned the galaxy. Oppenheimer asked why they had woken him. He asked if they wanted him to build another bomb. Malcador shook his head. He gestured to the open door. Through the gap, Oppenheimer could see the horizon. It was lit by the continuous flash of orbital lances striking the surface. The world was already burning. Malcador explained the reality of the Imperium. He said they did not need him to invent death. They had mastered death long ago. The Emperor possessed armies that could depopulate a star system in a month. Violence was not the deficit. Control was the deficit. The Imperium needed to harness stars to power their fleets. They needed to breach the walls of reality to travel between worlds. They needed a mind that understood the fundamental forces of the universe without worshipping them as magic. The Martian priesthood was useful, but they were shackled by dogma. The Emperor needed a scientist who remembered the scientific method. Oppenheimer stood up. His legs shook. He looked at the destruction outside. He felt the familiar weight in his chest. It was the weight of consequence. He realized that his legacy had never ended. The fire he stole had consumed the planet. Now a warlord in gold wanted him to help manage the flames. He realized he had no choice. If he stayed, he died. If he ran, he died. The only path was forward into the machinery of this new empire. He looked at the Space Marines. They watched him with the indifference of wolves watching a sheep. He looked at Malcador. He asked what the job was. Malcador smiled a thin, dry smile. He said the job was to build the engines for the Great Crusade. He said the job was to illuminate the galaxy. Oppenheimer closed his eyes for a moment. He accepted the burden. He followed the Sigillite out into the grey wasteland. The transport shuttle hummed with a vibration that rattled Robert Oppenheimer's teeth. He sat strapped into a metal bucket seat that offered no comfort. The interior of the craft smelled of recycled sweat and ozone. Opposite him sat two silent soldiers in carapace armor. They held LAR rifles across their chests. They did not look at him. They stared at the bulkhead with the blank focus of men bred for obedience. Oppenheimer rubbed his thin hands together. The cold in the upper atmosphere was biting. He wore the grey robe Malcador had given him. It was heavy and rough against his skin. It scratched like wool, but felt synthetic. He looked out the small, reinforced viewport. Below him, the surface of Terra stretched out like a map of scars. There were no green forests. There were no blue oceans. There were only hives. Massive, jagged mountain ranges of steel and ferrocrete pierced the cloud layer. Smoke poured from millions of stacks. The planet was a factory. It was a machine that produced weapons and soldiers. Oppenheimer felt a familiar sickness in his stomach. He had worried about the industrial military complex in his own time. That complex was a toy compared to this. This was a civilization that had eaten its own mother. The shuttle banked hard. The gravitational dampeners were crude. Oppenheimer's stomach lurched. The pilot's voice crackled over the Voxcaster. It was a harsh sound. It sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. The pilot announced their approach to the Imperial Palace. Oppenheimer looked down again. He saw it. It was not a building. It was a continent of gold and marble. It covered the mountain range he once knew as the Himalayas. Walls rose kilometers into the sky. Every inch was covered in statues and batteries of anti-air cannons. The scale made no sense to his physicist brain. The structural integrity of such walls should have failed. The mass should have cracked the tectonic plates, yet it stood. It stood through sheer force of will and lost engineering. He saw the flicker of void shields shimmering in the air. He recognized the ionization patterns. It was energy manipulation on a scale that required the output of a small star, and they used it just for a wall. The shuttle landed on a platform that jutted out from a spire. The wind whipped Oppenheimer's hair as the ramp descended. The air here was thin but filtered. It tasted metallic. A servitor waited for him at the base of the ramp. This was the first time Oppenheimer had seen one up close. He stopped. He stared. It was a human man, or it had been. Half the skull was replaced with brass plating. A red optical lens replaced one eye. The right arm was gone. In its place was a heavy hydraulic clamp. Cables ran from the back of the skull into a backpack unit. The creature drooled slightly. It stood perfectly still. Oppenheimer looked at the guards. They nudged him forward. He walked past the thing. He felt a wave of revulsion that nearly made him retch. They had lobotomized a human being to carry luggage. This was the efficiency Malcador had spoken of. It was the efficiency of the slaughterhouse. He was led through corridors that were wide enough to drive a tank through. The floors were black marble. The walls were lined with banners depicting a golden eagle gripping lightning bolts. Thousands of people moved through the halls. Scribes carried stacks of parchment that towered over their heads. Functionaries in stiff robes shouted into data slates. No one looked at each other. Everyone was running. Everyone was late. It was a bureaucracy of panic. Oppenheimer realized that despite the gold and the technology, this empire was desperate. They were running out of time. He was brought to a heavy blast door. A skull scanner read his retinal pattern. The light was blindingly red. The doors hissed open. Inside was a laboratory. It was vast. Cables hung from the ceiling like vines in a jungle. In the center of the room sat a massive engine block. It pulsed with a blue light. Malcador was there. He stood by a console reading a stream of data. He did not look up as Oppenheimer entered. The Sigillite simply pointed to the engine. He said that this was the sextiting pattern plasma generator. He said it was designed to power the lance batteries of a heavy cruiser. He said it had a failure rate of 14%. When it failed, it vented superheated plasma into the gunnery deck. It killed 300 crewmen instantly. The Mechanicum considered this an acceptable tie to the machine spirit. The Emperor disagreed. The Emperor needed the ships to survive long campaigns in the galactic void. He could not replace trained crews every time a capacitor blew. Malcador turned his ancient eyes to Oppenheimer. He told him to fix it. He gave him no team. He gave him no manual. He simply gave him the machine and the command. Oppenheimer approached the device. He felt small next to it. The casing was engraved with prayers. He ran his hand over the metal. It was cold. He looked for a control interface. He found a set of brass levers and a glass screen that displayed binary code. He did not read binary. He looked around for a tool. He saw a workbench covered in mechadendrites and soldering irons. He picked up a wrench. He began to unbolt the casing. A red alarm blared immediately. A voice boomed from the walls. It was a synthesized voice. It warned of tech heresy. It warned of unauthorized access. Oppenheimer ignored it. He kept turning the bolt. He needed to see the core. He needed to see the reaction chamber. The door to the lab hissed open again. A figure entered. It was robed in rust-red cloth. It was taller than a man. It moved on a set of spider-like metal legs that clicked on the marble. A hood covered the face. From the darkness of the hood, a green eye glowed. A metal tentacle snake out from the robes. It held a cog-toothed axe. This was a Magos of the Mechanicum. The Magos emitted a screech of static. It spoke in a mix of high Gothic and machine code. It demanded to know why the flesh creature was defiling the sacred engine. Oppenheimer dropped the wrench. He held up his hands. He tried to speak. He tried to explain he was inspecting the magnetic containment field. The Magos did not listen. It stepped forward. The axe raised. The Magos declared that the motive force was being insulted. It declared that the machine spirit was angry. Malcador stepped between them. He did not raise a weapon. He simply tapped his staff on the ground. The sound rang like a bell. The Magos froze. Malcador spoke softly. He told the Magos that this man was under the direct protection of the throne. He told the Magos that the Omnissiah had willed this inspection. The Magos lowered the axe. It twitched. It processed the command. It did not like it. It argued that the blueprint was from the dark age of technology and could not be altered. To alter it was to invite corruption. Malcador countered. He said that stagnation was corruption. He ordered the Magos to assist the physicist. The Magos bowed stiffly. It retreated to the corner of the room. It watched with its green electric eye. It was waiting for a mistake. Oppenheimer returned to the engine. He removed the casing. He peered inside. He saw the problem immediately. It was not a spiritual problem. It was a thermal problem. The magnetic coils were aligned in a perfect circle. That was aesthetically pleasing. But it created a harmonic resonance when the energy output peaked. The resonance destabilized the containment field. The heat had nowhere to go. It was a basic error in thermodynamics. Whoever had designed this had prioritized the symbolism of the circle over the physics of heat dissipation. Oppenheimer asked for a slate and a stylus. The Magos hesitated, then had a servitor bring the items. Oppenheimer began to draw. He drew a new configuration. He drew an elliptical coil structure. He added heat sinks made of ceramic plating. He calculated the flow of ions. The math flowed out of him. It was a language he still spoke fluently. He worked for hours. His back ached. His hands shook. He paused only to drink water from a metal flask. The food they brought him was a nutrient brick that tasted like dust. He ate it mechanically. He did not sleep. The Magos watched him. Occasionally, the Magos would beep in protest as Oppenheimer disconnected a holy cable. Oppenheimer explained his actions. He spoke to the Magos like a student. He explained that the cable was redundant. He explained that the resistance in the wire was causing a voltage drop. The Magos listened. It recorded. It did not understand the theory, but it could not deny the logic of the circuit. The friction between them was palpable. The Magos viewed the machine as a god. Oppenheimer viewed it as a tool. 3 days passed. Oppenheimer's eyes were rimmed with red. He smelled of sweat and old smoke. He had found a packet of glow sticks in a supply crate. They were harsh and burned his throat, but the nicotine steadied his nerves. He had reassembled the engine. It looked ugly now. The smooth casing was gone. Wires hung loose. Ceramic plates were bolted on at odd angles. The beautiful circle was broken. The Magos made a sound of disgust. It sounded like a dial-up modem disconnecting. It called the device an abomination. It said the machine spirit would weep. Oppenheimer wiped grease from his forehead. He told Malcador he was ready. Malcador nodded. He pressed a rune on the wall. A siren sounded. The blast doors opened. A squad of Imperial fists marched in. They were yellow giants. Their armor hummed. They took positions around the room. They were there to contain the explosion if Oppenheimer was wrong. A tech priest hooked the engine up to a test bank. A massive power conduit was connected. Oppenheimer stood back. He lit a glow stick. His hand trembled slightly. He took a drag. He exhaled blue smoke. He nodded to the operator. The operator threw the switch. The engine whined. The sound pitched up. It went from a low thrum to a high scream. The blue light in the center intensified. It became blinding. The heat in the room rose. The Magos stepped back, clutching its axe. It expected the vents to blow. It expected the plasma to arc. Oppenheimer watched the gauges. The pressure needle climbed. It hit the red zone. It kept climbing. The Magos prepared to chant the rite of emergency shutdown. Oppenheimer held up a hand. He waited. The needle stabilized. It sat deep in the red zone, but it did not move. The engine roared, but it did not shake. The heat sinks glowed cherry red. They were absorbing the excess thermal energy. They were doing their job. The output monitor showed a reading. Energy flow was stable at 140% of maximum rated capacity. The engine was producing nearly half again, as much power as the standard model, and it was not exploding. The harmonic resonance was gone. The ellipse worked. The physics held. The room was silent except for the roar of the plasma. The Imperial fists lowered their bolters. Malcador looked at the readout. He looked at Oppenheimer. There was no praise in his eyes, only calculation. He saw an asset that had just increased the lethality of the Imperial Navy by 40%. The Magos moved forward. It extended a mechadendrite to touch the engine. It scanned the heat sinks. It scanned the elliptical coils. It processed the data. It could not argue with the reality. The machine was not suffering. The machine was singing. The Magos turned to Oppenheimer. It asked what prayer he had used. It asked what ritual had appeased the spirit of the coil. Oppenheimer dropped his cigarette butt on the pristine floor. He crushed it with his heel. He said there was no prayer. He said it was just geometry. The Magos stared at him. The concept was alien. To the Martian, geometry was prayer. To separate them was heresy. But the engine worked, and in the Imperium, results were the only truth that mattered. The test ended. The engine was powered down. The cooling metal ticked. Malcador dismissed the guards. He walked over to Oppenheimer. He handed him a data slate. It was a list. It was a list of every major system on a Gloriana-class battleship. Void shields, macro cannons, life support, warp drives. Malcador told him that this was his new schedule. He told him that the Crusade fleets were launching in 6 months. He needed this efficiency applied to everything. Oppenheimer looked at the list. It was a mountain of work. It was impossible. He looked at his shaking hands. He felt the fatigue in his bones. He asked if he could have a team of scientists, real scientists, not priests. Malcador said he would see what he could do, but he warned him. The Mechanicum was jealous. They controlled the technology. Oppenheimer was an outsider. He was a threat to their monopoly on truth. If he pushed too hard, they would not argue with him. They would simply arrange an accident, a plasma vent failure, a radiation leak. Oppenheimer understood. He was walking a tightrope. On one side was the crushing demand of the Emperor's war. On the other was the fanatical dogma of Mars. And he was just a man in a grey robe with a slide rule. He was escorted to his quarters. It was a small cell near the lab. It had a cot and a desk. There were no windows. He sat on the cot. He felt the weight of the mountain above him. He felt the vibration of the thousands of ships being built in orbit. He closed his eyes. He saw the flash of the bomb he had built in the desert so long ago. He saw the faces of the dead. Now he was building engines for a war that would kill billions. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself that this species was on the brink of extinction. He told himself that without these ships, the monsters in the dark would eat them all. It was the same logic he had used before. It tasted like ash in his mouth. The next morning, the work began in earnest. Oppenheimer established a routine. He woke up. He ate the nutrient paste. He went to the lab. He worked until his eyes blurred. He slept. He did not see the sun. He did not see the sky. He only saw blueprints and brass gears. He began to learn the language of the tech priests. He learned to hide his physics inside their theology. He learned to call a voltage regulator a spirit damper. He learned to call a circuit check a right of query. It was the mask. He wore it to survive. The tech priests began to tolerate him. They did not like him, but they coveted his results. They watched him like hawks. They recorded every stroke of his stylus. They were stealing his knowledge, repackaging it as a revelation from the Omnissiah. Oppenheimer let them. He did not care about credit. He only cared about the problem. 1 month into his confinement, a visitor came. It was not a tech priest. It was a space marine. He was not wearing a helmet. His skin was the color of onyx. His eyes were burning red coals. He wore green armor. He was huge, even for an Astartes. He carried a heavy hammer at his belt. It was Vulkan, the Primarch of the 16 foreign Bible, Legion. He ducked his head to enter the lab. The room seemed to shrink around him. The servitors stopped their drone. Even the air seemed to still. Vulkan walked up to the workbench. He looked at the messy schematics. He looked at the half-disassembled laser array Oppenheimer was fixing. Vulkan spoke. His voice was deep, like the earth shifting. He asked Oppenheimer what he was making. Oppenheimer looked up. He was not afraid. He was too tired to be afraid. He said he was trying to focus the beam coherence. He said the lenses were low quality. Vulkan nodded. He picked up a lens. He held it up to the light. He squeezed it. The glass cracked. Oppenheimer flinched. Vulkan apologized. He said the glass was weak. He reached into a pouch on his belt. He pulled out a crystal. It glowed with an inner fire. He placed it on the table. He said it was obsidian from the fire plains of Nocturne. He said it would handle the heat better. Oppenheimer picked up the crystal. It was flawless. He looked at the Primarch. He asked why he was helping. Vulkan looked at the engine. He said that a weapon that breaks kills the man who wields it. He said he cared for his sons. He wanted them to have gear that worked. He looked at Oppenheimer with a strange intensity. He said he saw the sadness in the scientist's soul. He said he knew the burden of the Maker. To create is to destroy. Vulkan placed a massive hand on Oppenheimer's shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort, but it nearly crushed the physicist's collarbone. Vulkan said that they were both smiths. They both hammered the hot iron. He told Oppenheimer not to lose himself in the fire. The Primarch left as quickly as he had arrived. He left the crystal in a silence that felt heavy. Oppenheimer stared at the door. He realized that these demigods were not just biological weapons. They were intelligent. They had personalities. They had philosophies. This terrified him more than their muscles. A weapon that thinks is a weapon that can judge. And if they judged him, what would they see? He turned back to the laser array. He fitted the Nocturnian crystal. It fit perfectly. He aligned the mirrors. He tested the beam. It was razor sharp. It cut through a 3-inch steel plate in 2 seconds. It was a masterpiece of destruction. Weeks turned into months. The pile of fixed blueprints grew. The efficiency of the Imperial war machine ticked up by fractions of a percentage. In a galaxy-spanning empire, those fractions meant millions of tons of supplies saved. They meant fleets arriving a week early. They meant battles won that would have been lost. Oppenheimer became a ghost in the machine. He was rarely seen. He was a rumor. The architect of the atom, they called him in whispers. The Mechanicum hated the name. They called him the recalibrator. They tried to minimize his role. Then came the crisis that defined his position. A message came from the shipyards of Jupiter. A prototype warp drive had suffered a catastrophic containment breach during a static fire test. It had not exploded. It had done something worse. It had created a micro-singularity, a tear in reality. It was growing. It was eating the shipyard. The tech priests on Jupiter were chanting at it. They were throwing servitors into it to clog the rift. It was not working. Malcador came to the lab. His face was grim. He told Oppenheimer to pack his tools. They were going to Jupiter. The flight to Jupiter took weeks in real space travel, even with the high-speed courier ship. Oppenheimer spent the time studying the telemetry from the shipyard. The numbers were erratic. The laws of physics were breaking down near the rift. He saw variables that shouldn't exist. He saw constants that were changing. It was the warp. He had heard of it. He had treated it as a theoretical dimension of pure energy. Now he looked at the data and saw chaos. It wasn't just energy. It was malevolent. The equations seemed to fight him. They shifted when he looked away. It was maddening. They arrived at the Jovian shipyards. The scale of the disaster was visible from the viewport. A massive orbital dock, capable of holding 3 battle barges, was being twisted. The metal was warping like melted wax. Purple lightning arced across the vacuum. Debris was swirling into a black sphere in the center of the structure. The sphere was only 10 meters wide, but its gravitational pull was immense. The courier ship shuddered as it docked at a safe distance. Oppenheimer donned a void suit. It was heavy and clumsy. He clamped his helmet on. The hiss of oxygen was loud in his ears. He was led to the control center of the station. The view was apocalyptic. Tech priests were running everywhere. Klaxons were blaring silently in the vacuum, flashing red lights bathing the room. The fabricator of the station, a magos with 4 mechanical arms, was screaming binary code at a bank of cogitators. Oppenheimer pushed past him. He looked at the readings. The singularity was feeding on the power core of the station. The tech priests were trying to shut down the core, but the interface was corrupted. The machine spirit was screaming. Oppenheimer saw the logic flow. The shutdown command was being routed through the logic gates of the central processor. The processor was infected by the warp anomaly. It was rewriting the code as fast as they entered it. They were trying to talk to a rabid dog. Oppenheimer grabbed a Vox unit. He yelled at the Magos. He told him to manually sever the power conduits. The Magos refused. He said the conduits were blessed. To cut them was to bleed the station dry. It would take decades to repair. Oppenheimer screamed back. He said if they didn't cut them, there would be no station in an hour. There would be no Jupiter shipyards. The Magos hesitated. Bureaucracy and dogma paralyzed him. He looked at the regulations. He looked at the holy text. There was no verse for warp singularity eating the dock. Oppenheimer didn't wait. He grabbed a laser cutter from a nearby rack. He ran towards the airlock that led to the conduit access tunnel. Malcador's personal guard, a stormtrooper in carapace armor, moved to stop him. Malcador's voice came over the Vox. "Let him go." Oppenheimer ran. The void suit chafed. His breath fogged the visor. Gravity was fluctuating. Sometimes he weighed a ton. Sometimes he floated. He reached the access tunnel. It was a long corridor lined with thick cables pulsing with power. The air was cold. Frost formed on his suit. He found the main junction. It was a knot of cables as thick as tree trunks. He fired the laser cutter. The beam hissed. He started slicing through the protective casing. Sparks flew. The metal glowed molten orange. The ship shuddered. The singularity groaned. It sensed the food source being threatened. Oppenheimer felt a wave of nausea. He heard whispers in his head, voices promising him knowledge, voices promising him the unified field theory, voices promising him the secrets of the universe. He shook his head. He knew these voices. They were the same voices he heard when he looked at the mushroom cloud. They were the voices of pride. He cut deeper. The first cable snapped. A blinding arc of electricity jumped to the wall. His suit's grounding shunts flared. He kept cutting. The second cable snapped. The lights in the corridor died. Emergency red lights kicked in. The gravity failed completely. He floated, anchoring himself with one leg hooked around the strut. He cut the third cable. The whispers turned to screams. The purple light from the viewport dimmed. The singularity was starving. He cut the final cable. Darkness. Absolute darkness. The station was dead. The power was gone. Oppenheimer floated in the dark. He listened to his own breathing. He waited for the singularity to eat him. It didn't. The gravity stabilized. The anomaly, cut off from the massive energy of the station's core, collapsed on itself. It vanished with a silent pop that registered on his suit's sensors. He hung there, exhausted. He had destroyed a power grid worth the GDP of a 20th century nation. But he had saved the shipyard. A light flickered. Emergency power kicked in. The airlock cycled. The Magos floated in. He looked at the severed cables. The copper ends were fused and ugly. It was a butcher's job. The Magos looked at Oppenheimer. There was no gratitude, only calculation. The station was saved, but the sacred cables were murdered. The Magos calculated the repair time. It would be 5 years. But the shipyard remained. The fleets could still dock. The logic held. The Magos bowed his head slightly. It was the only concession he would make. Oppenheimer was brought back to the command deck. Malcador was waiting. The Sigillite looked at the telemetry. The crisis was over. Oppenheimer removed his helmet. He was sweating. He wiped his face. He asked for a cigarette. No one had one. He slumped in a chair. He looked at the black void outside. He realized he had just fought a battle against physics itself, and he had won. But the whispers worried him. He had heard them clearly. They knew his name. They returned to Terra. The incident at Jupiter was classified. Oppenheimer's file was redacted. He was given a commendation that he could never show anyone. He went back to his lab. The work continued, but something had changed. The tech priest looked at him differently now, not just with disdain, but with fear. He was the man who cut the throat of the machine to save it. He was dangerous, and in the Imperium, danger was a currency. Oppenheimer sat at his desk. He looked at the pile of blueprints. He picked up his stylus. He began to work on the next problem. The Geller field generators for the transport barges. They were failing in deep warp. He looked at the equations. He remembered the whispers. He realized that the Geller field wasn't just a shield. It was a bubble of reality. He needed to make the bubble stronger. He needed to reinforce the laws of physics against the madness outside. He began to write. He wrote with a new urgency. He knew now what was out there. He wasn't just building engines anymore. He was building the walls of the fortress, and the night was coming. 7 years passed in the shadow of the Imperial Palace. Robert Oppenheimer was dying. It was not a fast death. It was the slow erosion of a man living in a world hostile to his biology. The gravity of Terra was slightly different from the earth of his birth. It pulled at his joints. His spine ached constantly. The air scrubbers in his laboratory filtered out the toxins, but they could not filter out the despair. He coughed into a handkerchief. It came away spotted with blood. He folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. He did not tell the medics. If he told them, they would replace his lungs with vat-grown organs. He wanted to keep the parts of himself that he was born with. He wanted to remain human as long as possible. He stood before a holographic table. It displayed the galactic plane. The Great Crusade was a spreading stain of gold ink across the dark void. It looked triumphant. It looked inevitable. Oppenheimer knew better. He saw the logistics reports. He saw the fuel consumption rates. He saw the casualty lists that were redacted before they reached the High Lords. The Imperium was winning, but it was bleeding to do it. Every fleet that jumped into the warp took damage. Not physical damage, but structural fatigue. The Geller fields were standard, but the warp was becoming more turbulent. The storms were getting worse. Ships were arriving with crews that had aged 50 years in a week. Ships were arriving with captains who had gouged out their own eyes. Malcador entered the room. The Sigillite did not knock. He moved like a shadow that had detached itself from the wall. He looked older too. His skin was like parchment stretched over a skull. He carried a heavy staff. He stood beside Oppenheimer and looked at the map. He pointed to the galactic northeast, the halo stars. The region was marked in red. Oppenheimer knew what that meant. It meant a xenocide campaign. It meant a war of extermination. Malcador spoke. He said the Ivy Legion was pinned down. He said the Iron Warriors were fighting a species called the Rangdan. He said the Rangdan did not fight like orcs or Aldari. They fought with biology and frequency. They enslaved the minds of the human auxiliaries. They turned the crews of the Imperial ships against the Space Marines. A battleship would drop its shields because the bridge crew suddenly decided they loved the alien. Then the Rangdan ships, which looked like masses of twisting flesh and silver needles, would latch on. They would butcher everyone. The loss rate was 40%. It was unsustainable. Oppenheimer asked what he could do. He was a physicist, not a general. Malcador handed him a heavy iron key. He said that the Primarch Perturabo had requested him, specifically him. The Lord of Iron had read Oppenheimer's papers on the Jupiter singularity. Perturabo was a scholar of physics. He believed the problem was not biological. He believed the Rangdan mind control was a frequency, a waveform. Malcador told Oppenheimer to pack his bags. He was going to the front. He was going to the slaughterhouse. The journey to the Halo stars took 3 months. Oppenheimer traveled on a heavy transport protected by a custodian guard. He spent the time reading the combat logs of the IV Legion. There were dry, brutal lists of coordinates and casualty counts. He read about the Rangdan. They were Cerberus-caste Xenos, slithering, wolf-like, multi-limbed horrors that grew technology out of their own bodies. But the terror was their hell. It was a psychic scream that shattered the ego. Oppenheimer began to sketch equations. He treated the psychic scream as a radio signal. If it was a signal, it could be jammed. If it could be jammed, it could be killed. He arrived at the mustering anchor. It was the deep void station Golgotha. It hung in the darkness of space like a severed head. Surrounding it was the fleet of the IV Legion. The ships were grey and black. They were scarred. Burn marks streaked their hulls. They looked like tools that had been used to break rocks. Oppenheimer's shuttle docked at the flagship, the Iron Blood. The airlock cycled. He stepped out onto a deck made of raw steel. There were no golden eagles here. There were no banners. There was only hazard stripes and the smell of oil. A squad of iron warriors waited for him. They were massive. Their armor was unpainted ceramite, dull and grey. They did not speak. They turned and marched. Oppenheimer followed. He had to run to keep up with their stride. They led him through the bowels of the ship. He saw servitors welding plates onto hull breaches. He saw mortal crewmen sleeping in the corridors, exhausted, their uniforms stained with grease. This was a ship at war. It felt heavy. It felt resentful. They reached the strategium. It was a circular room dominated by data feeds. In the center stood Perturabo. The Primarch was a mountain of iron. He wore the Logos, a suit of Terminator armor that he had customized himself. Hundreds of cables linked his armor to the ship's cogitators. He was processing the data of the entire fleet directly into his brain. He unplugged a cable from his temple as Oppenheimer entered. The hiss of the disconnection was loud. Perturabo turned. His face was cold, noble, and incredibly sad. He looked like a statue of a Greek god that had been left out in the rain for 1,000 years. Perturabo did not offer a hand. He offered a data slate. He spoke in a voice that sounded like tectonic plates grinding. He said he had reviewed the elliptical coil design. He said it was elegant. He said it solved the heat dissipation issue by using the geometry of the curve rather than forced cooling. He appreciated the logic. Then his face darkened. He said logic was failing them against the Rangdan. He showed a video feed. The screen flickered. It showed the bridge of a cruiser, the hammer of Olympia. The crew was working calmly. Then a low hum became audible. The audio sensors peaked. The crew stopped. They stood up. In unison, they drew their sidearms. They put the barrels in their mouths. They pulled the triggers. The bridge was painted red in a second. The ship drifted. The shields fell. The feed cut to static. Perturabo looked at Oppenheimer. He said his sons were immune. Their transhuman physiology resisted the signal. But the ships needed mortals. The weapons needed loaders. The engines needed tenders. Without the mortals, the fleet was dead iron. He needed a shield. He needed a Geller field that operated in real space. He needed Oppenheimer to build a wall against the scream. Oppenheimer looked at the dead crew on the frozen screen. He felt the cold calculation of the problem. It was an isolation issue. The human mind was a receiver. The Rangdan were the transmitter. He needed to build a Faraday cage for the soul. He asked to see the engine decks. Perturabo nodded. He escorted the physicist himself. They walked through the ship. Perturabo spoke of architecture. He spoke of the amphitheaters he wanted to build on Olympia. He spoke of the democratic assemblies he wanted to design. He sounded like a man who wanted to be an artist, but was forced to be a butcher. Oppenheimer understood him. He told Perturabo about the Institute for Advanced Study. He told him about the desire to understand the universe, not to blow it up. Perturabo listened. For a moment, there was a connection. Two men who knew the math of creation, but were employed by the god of war. They reached the engineering bay. It was a cavern. The warp drive hummed with potential energy. Oppenheimer walked around the core. He touched the housing. He realized the standard Geller field generator was too coarse. It created a bubble, but the mesh was too wide. The Rangdan signal was a micro-frequency. It slipped through the gaps. He needed to tighten the weave. He needed to modulate the field frequency to match the inverse of the Rangdan's scream. It was noise-cancelling headphone technology applied to psychic warfare. He worked for 2 weeks. He barely ate. He smoked his LHO sticks until the air in the small workshop Perturabo gave him was blue. The Primarch would visit him. He would stand silently and watch Oppenheimer derive the formulas. Sometimes Perturabo would point a massive armored finger at an equation and correct a variable. He was a genius. His mind computed faster than any machine, but he lacked Oppenheimer's intuition. Perturabo knew how the universe worked. Oppenheimer knew why it felt that way. They built the prototype. It was a jagged, ugly machine bolted to the deck of a frigate, the Steel Virtue. It looked like a radio tower made of black iron and copper coils. It was designed to project a null zone with a radius of 50,000 kilometers. Inside that zone, the Rangdan signal would be scrambled. The cost was power. The machine ate energy. It required a direct tap from the plasma reactor, and it produced a byproduct, hard radiation, not just alpha and beta particles, but exotic radiation that degraded cellular structure instantly. The test came too soon. The Rangdan fleet was detected moving towards the Advexmore system. It was a forge world, a planet-sized factory. If it fell, the crusade in this sector would run out of ammunition in a month. The IV Legion deployed. The Steel Virtue was placed in the center of the formation. Oppenheimer was on board. He insisted. He needed to tune the frequency. Perturabo argued, but eventually agreed. He assigned a squad of Terminators to guard the physicist. The battle began in the void above the forge world. The stars were blotted out by the Rangdan ships. They were organic nightmares, twitching and leaking fluids into space. They fired spines of bone that punched through void shields. The Imperial fleet opened fire with macro cannons. The silence of space was filled with the flash of silent explosions. Then came the scream. Oppenheimer saw it on the sensors before he heard it. It was a spike in the psionic band, a tsunami of hate. He slammed his hand onto the activation rune of the null emitter. The machine roared. The copper coils glowed blinding white. The power drain on the ship was instant. The lights died. Emergency red lighting bathed the deck. The gravity fluctuated. On the bridge of the Steel Virtue, the mortal crew screamed. They grabbed their heads. Blood ran from their noses. But they did not turn. They did not kill themselves. The signal was garbled. It was static. The null zone was holding. Oppenheimer watched the readout. The frequency was drifting. He had to manually adjust the dials. His hands were shaking. The radiation counter on his belt was clicking so fast it sounded like a continuous buzz. He was taking a lethal dose every 10 minutes. He swallowed a heavy iodine pill and kept working. The battle raged for 6 hours. The null zone held the center. Protected by the bubble, the Iron Warriors' ships decimated the Rangdan. The Xenos could not use their greatest weapon. They were forced to fight a gunnery duel against the masters of siege warfare. They were being slaughtered. Perturabo directed the fleet with cold precision. He used the steel virtue as a shield, pivoting the formation around it. But the machine was overheating. The cooling vents were clogged with fused metal. The radiation in the engineering bay was now critical. The tech priests tending the machine were dying. Their skin was sloughing off. They kept working. They chanted binary prayers as their organs liquefied. Oppenheimer saw Amagos collapse, his legs giving out. A servitor stepped over the body and continued to turn a valve. Then the Rangdan adapted. They focused their entire psychic output on the steel virtue. The pressure on the field was immense. The coils began to vibrate. Cracks appeared in the casing. Oppenheimer saw the wave coming. It was a focused lance of mental energy. If it hit, the machine would overload. The resulting feedback would not just kill the field. It would detonate the ship's reactor. Oppenheimer yelled into the Vox. He told the captain to vent the plasma. The captain refused. If they vented, the shield dropped. If the shield dropped, the fleet died. Oppenheimer looked at the machine. There was a manual override for the output limiter. If he removed the safety, he could push the field to 200%. It would burn out the Rangdan transmitters, but the backlash would flood the engineering deck with thermal radiation. It would cook everyone in the room instantly. He looked around. There were 50 people in the bay. Tech priests, servitors, armsmen. They were fighting to keep the ship alive. They were human. They had names. He looked at the Terminators guarding him. They were statues. They would survive the radiation. Their armor was thick enough. Oppenheimer realized he was the only unarmored human who understood what had to be done. He didn't hesitate. He had hesitated once in a desert in New Mexico. He had debated the morality of the bomb. Here, there was no debate. There was only the math of survival. 50 lives for 50,000. The calculus of the Imperium. He ran to the console. He typed the command sequence. The system asked for confirmation. It warned of catastrophic biological termination. Oppenheimer pressed the rune. The machine shrieked. A pulse of invisible energy blasted out from the ship. It hit the Rangdan fleet like a hammer. The organic ships convulsed. Their neural networks fried. The scream died instantly. The alien ships went adrift, their crews lobotomized by the feedback. The Imperial fleet ceased fire. The silence returned. In the engineering bay, the heat was physical. It hit Oppenheimer like a wall. He fell to his knees. The air tasted of copper and cooked meat. He looked around. The mortal crew was dead. They had not burned. They had simply ceased to function. Their nervous systems had been overloaded by the radiation spike. They lay slumped over their stations. The tech priests were still, their mechadendrites hanging limp. Oppenheimer retched. He vomited bile onto the deck. He was alive. The lead-lined robe and the personal void shield generator Malcador had insisted he wear had saved him. Barely. His skin felt like it was sunburnt. His eyes burned. He looked up. A Terminator stepped forward. The giant looked at the devastation. The warrior nodded. "Target neutralized," the giant said. There was no horror in his voice, just confirmation. The battle was won. The Advex Moore system was saved. The rundown fleet was broken debris floating in the void. Perturabo came aboard the Steel Virtue an hour later. He walked into the engineering bay. He ignored the bodies. He walked straight to the machine. He inspected the coils. He saw the fused override switch. He turned to Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was sitting on a crate, shaking. He was smoking a low stick with trembling fingers. Perturabo loomed over him. The Primarch removed his helmet. His face was unreadable. "You exceeded the safety parameters," Perturabo stated. "I saved your fleet," Oppenheimer whispered. His voice was raspy. The smoke hurt his throat. "You spent the crew," Perturabo corrected. "Resource expenditure was high, but the strategic gain is absolute." The Primarch paused. He looked at the dead men. "They performed their function, as did you." Oppenheimer looked up at the demigod. "They were people," he said. "They weren't variables." Perturabo's eyes narrowed. "In this war, Robert, everything is a variable. Even me, especially you." He turned away. "Repair the machine. We move on the Hood systems in 3 days. I need this shield functional." Perturabo walked out. The heavy tread of his boots rang on the deck. Oppenheimer was left alone with the dead. He looked at the machine he had built. It was black and ugly and smelled of death. He realized then that he hadn't just built a shield. He had built an altar, and he was the high priest who held the knife. He finished his cigarette. He flicked the butt onto the body of a dead ensign. He stood up. His legs were weak. He walked to the tool bench. He picked up a wrench. He began to unbolt the fused plating. There was no time to mourn. The crusade did not stop for grief. The machine had to be fixed. The efficiency had to be maintained. The next day, a shuttle arrived from Terra. It was a courier. It carried a small box. Inside was a medal, the Star of Terra. It was the highest civilian honor. There was also a note from Malcador. It read, "The fire cleanses. Do not look away." Oppenheimer threw the medal into his locker. He did not look at it. He went back to work. But the radiation had done its work. His hair began to thin. His gums bled. The fatigue settled into his marrow. He was falling apart. He asked for a Medici scan. The doctor, a chirurgeon of the Mechanicum, scanned him. The results were bad. Cellular degradation on a genetic level. The doctor offered cybernetics. He offered to replace the failing limbs with steel. Oppenheimer refused. He would not become like them. He would finish his work as a man. The campaign dragged on. The null emitter became standard issue for the Vanguard fleets. Oppenheimer refined the design. He found a way to shield the crew better. He reduced the fatality rate to 5% per activation. He called it an improvement. The logs called it a triumph. He stopped remembering the names of the crew. It was easier that way. He became a ghost on the Iron Blood. The Iron Warriors respected him. They called him the Breaker of Screams. It was a title of honor. To Oppenheimer, it sounded like an accusation. One night, during a lull in the fighting, he sat in the observation dome. He looked out at the stars. They looked cold. He remembered the Sanskrit verse he had quoted so long ago. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He realized he had been wrong. He wasn't the destroyer. The Emperor was the destroyer. Perturabo was the destroyer. Oppenheimer was just the man who sharpened the sword. He was the man who made the destruction efficient. And that, he realized, was a far greater sin. He saw a reflection in the glass. It wasn't his own. It was a face made of smoke and shadow. It smiled at him. It was the same presence he had felt at Jupiter. It was waiting. It knew that every time he chose the logical sacrifice, he chipped away a piece of his soul. It was patient. It knew that eventually there would be nothing left of Robert Oppenheimer but the logic. and then he would belong to it. He closed his eyes and turned away from the glass. He went back to his quarters. He had a Geller field to calibrate. The work never ended. The shuttle descent into the atmosphere of Terra was no longer the turbulent ride it had been a decade ago. The skies were tamed, vast atmospheric processing stations, floating like silver islands in the smog, regulated the entry corridors. Robert Oppenheimer watched the patterns of traffic from his viewport. The anarchy of the unification wars was gone, replaced by a terrifying grid of order. Thousands of heavy lifters moved in synchronous lines, carrying raw materials down to the surface and lifting finished battalions up to the void. It was a conveyor belt of galactic conquest. Oppenheimer coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. He wiped his mouth with a linen cloth. It came away stained with the same rust-colored flecks that had plagued him since the Rangdan genocide. His body was failing. The cellular degradation was accelerating. The Mechanicum biologist had given him 5 years. That was 2 years ago. He was being recalled from the Ulanor sector. The triumph there was imminent. Horus Lupercal was crushing the Orc Empire with a brutality that was efficient, if inelegant. Oppenheimer had spent the last year optimizing the logistics chains for the Lunar Wolves. He had streamlined the supply of bolter shells, calculating the exact blast yield required to clear Orc spores from a trench line to save ammunition. He had turned genocide into an algebraic equation. He was good at it, too good. The Lunar Wolves treated him with a superstition that bordered on reverence. They called him the Accountant of Ash, but Malcador had sent a priority code, a single word: foundational. Oppenheimer knew what it meant. It meant the work on the surface was done. The real work, the work that required the mind that had unlocked the atom, was waiting in the dark. The landing platform at the Imperial Palace was different now. The gold was tarnished by the soot of industry. The statues were coated in grime. The war effort consumed everything, even the monument to its own glory. Malcador met him at the airlock. The Sigillite looked like a dried leaf that refused to crumble. He leaned heavily on his staff. There were no pleasantries. Malcador simply turned and walked toward a turbolift that Oppenheimer had never seen before. It did not go up to the spires. It went down past the administrative levels, down past the dungeons where the techno-barbarian warlords rotted, down into the crust of the planet. The air grew hot. It smelled of ozone and ancient stone. The humidity rose until Oppenheimer's grey robe clung to his skin. They stepped out into a cavern that defied description. It was a hollow the size of a city, carved and out with the bedrock beneath the Himalayas. In the center sat a machine. It was a mountain of gold and brass, a pyramid of machinery that hummed with a power so intense it made Oppenheimer's teeth ache. Cables the width of transit trains snaked out of the walls, feeding into the central throne. This was the Imperial dungeon. This was the Sanctum Imperialis. And standing before the machine, dwarfed by its scale yet commanding it with his presence, was the Emperor. He was not the golden warrior Oppenheimer had seen in the propaganda vids. Here he was a scientist. He wore a simple tech suit, his arms bare, covered in oil and coolant. He was working on a panel of fiber optic cabling with a pair of micro tweezers. Malcador stopped 10 meters away. He gestured for Oppenheimer to wait. The Emperor did not turn. He spoke, and his voice was not a sound but a resonance in the skull. He asked about the variance in the Geller field equations Oppenheimer had written for the IV Legion. He asked why Oppenheimer had chosen a variable of 0.04 instead of 0.03. Oppenheimer, trembling from the psychic weight of the being, answered. He stammered that .03 created a harmonic drag in the warp real space interface. It was safer but slower. .04 was dangerous, but it maintained velocity. The Emperor nodded. He turned. His eyes were like looking into a supernova. He said that velocity was the only thing that mattered now. Time was the enemy. The project was the webway. Oppenheimer was briefed in a side chamber filled with cogitators that dated back to the dark age of technology. The Emperor explained the truth. The warp was a cancer. It was a sea of predators. As long as humanity used it for travel, they were swimming in shark-infested waters with open wounds. The webway was a tunnel system, a separate dimension built by the old ones. It was safe. It was instant. If the Imperium could access it, they could abandon the warp drives. They could starve the chaos gods of the fear and misery caused by void travel. It was the ultimate strategic checkmate. But the human interface, the Golden Throne, was unstable. It required a psychic pilot of immense power to hold the gate open. The strain was burning out the components. It was burning out the pathfinders. Oppenheimer's task was not to build the gate. The gate existed. His task was to build the regulator. The throne was an amplifier. It took the psychic output of the user and focused it into a beam that pierced the veil of reality. But the feedback loop was catastrophic. The energy didn't just go out, it came back. It was like trying to hold a fire hose that was pumping magma. The backwash was frying the neural conduits of the throne. They needed a heatsink. They needed a way to ground the excess psychic energy without killing the pilot. Oppenheimer looked at the schematics. It was a problem of thermodynamics, but applied to souls instead of heat. He needed to create a system that could absorb pain. He set up his workspace in the shadow of the throne. The noise was constant. The crackle of arcing electricity, the grind of massive gears, the hum of the containment fields. He worked with a team of the Mechanicum's finest, the fabricator adjuncts of Mars. They were brilliant, but they were limited by their dogma. They saw the throne as a holy relic. They refused to stress test the components. Oppenheimer had no such qualms. He demanded they run the conduits to failure. He needed to know the breaking point. The first major test of the regulator occurred 3 months after his arrival. Oppenheimer had designed a series of psych-reactive crystal baffles. They were meant to act as a breaker switch. If the psychic pressure got too high, the crystals would shatter, severing the connection and saving the pilot. They hooked up a test subject. It was not the Emperor. It was a sanctioned psyker, a beta-level telepath taken from the black ships. The man was strapped into a secondary interface chair. He was screaming before they even turned it on. He could feel the weight of the machine waiting to eat him. Oppenheimer stood behind the blast glass. He watched the readouts. He ordered the power up. The Golden Throne hummed. The psyker arched his back. The neural jacks in his skull sparked. The energy flow spiked. The graph on Oppenheimer's slate went vertical. The psychic energy was flowing into the webway gate, pushing against the barrier. The gate began to shimmer. A portal opened, revealing a swirling tunnel of wraithbone and light. It was beautiful. It was a highway to the stars. Then the feedback hit. The warp pushed back. A surge of purple lightning shot out of the gate, into the throne, and into the psyker. The crystals Oppenheimer had installed glowed blue, then white. They vibrated. They were supposed to shatter. They didn't. They amplified the resonance. The psyker's head exploded. Not metaphorically. It detonated. The body caught fire. The feedback loop slammed into the main capacitors of the dungeon. Sparks showered down like rain. The gate collapsed with a sound like a thunderclap. The Emperor was there in an instant. He stepped through the fire unharmed. He severed the connection with a wave of his hand. He looked at the smoking remains of the chair. He looked at Oppenheimer. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed. He said the crystals were too pure. They conducted too well. They didn't offer resistance. They offered a highway for the backlash. Oppenheimer realized his mistake. He was treating psychic energy like electricity. He assumed it wanted to flow. It didn't. It wanted to consume. He needed a material that hated the warp. He needed a dampener that was spiritually inert. He went back to the drawing board. He barely slept. The air in the dungeon was rich with oxygen, but poor in hope. He began to experiment with blackstone. The material was rare, mined from the pylons of the Cadian Gate. It was known to repel warp energy. The Mechanicum called it the Abomination Stone. They refused to touch it. Oppenheimer had to cut the lenses himself. He wore a hazard suit, grinding the black rock into thin wafers. The dust made his skin itch. It felt like standing next to a void. The stone didn't reflect light. It drank it. While he worked, the politics of the surface began to seep down. The navigator houses, the mutants who guided the ships through the warp, had caught wind of the project. They didn't know the specifics, but they knew the Emperor was building something that would make them obsolete. Their power, their wealth, their monopoly on interstellar travel. It all hung in the balance. Oppenheimer began to notice discrepancies in his supply shipments. A crate of focusing lenses would arrive cracked. A delivery of coolant would be contaminated with acid. It was sabotage. He reported it to Malcador. The Sigillite's eyes went cold. He said he would handle it. 2 days later, the Paternova's envoy, a tall, spindly mutant with a third eye covered by a silk band, requested a meeting with Oppenheimer. Malcador advised him to take it. He said it was important to see the enemy. The meeting took place in an upper spire garden. The air was fresh, a stark contrast to the dungeon. The envoy was polite. He offered Oppenheimer wine. He spoke of the natural order. He said that humanity was meant to navigate the stars, not burrow through them like rats. He offered Oppenheimer a way out. He offered him a private estate on a paradise world. He offered him health. He said their gene crafters could reverse his cellular decay. They could give him 50 more years of life. Oppenheimer looked at the mutant. He felt the temptation. His lungs burned with every breath. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold a stylus. 50 years of peace. 50 years of sunlight. All he had to do was delay the project. Just a decimal point error here, a wrong material there. No one would know. Physics was complex. Failures were expected. He looked at the envoy's third eye, hidden beneath the band. He felt the subtle psychic pressure the mutant was exerting. A gentle nudge of suggestion. Oppenheimer set the wineglass down. He told the envoy that he had built a bomb once that killed 100,000 people in a second. He told him he had done it because he believed it would stop a war that would kill millions. He said he was now building a door that would save trillions. He asked the envoy if he really thought a summer home was enough to buy the man who had sold his soul to physics. The envoy's smile vanished. The psychic pressure spiked, becoming a headache. Oppenheimer stood up and walked away. He knew he had just made a powerful enemy. He didn't care. He was already dead. He was just waiting for his body to catch up. He returned to the dungeon. The blackstone wafers were ready. He installed them into the regulator array. This time, he changed the geometry. Instead of a direct flow, he created a spiral lattice. The energy would have to travel through layers of dampening stone before it would reach the pilot. It would increase the resistance, making the machine harder to use, but it would filter out the feedback. It was a filter for hell. The second test was different. There was no test subject available. The supply of sanctioned psychers had been delayed, another logistical error by the navigator-influenced bureaucracy. The timeline was tight. The crusade was stalling. The Emperor needed to leave Terra to attend to the webway construction within the tunnel itself. The throne needed to be active to anchor the reality of the tunnel while he worked. Someone had to sit in the chair. Malcador stepped forward. The Sigillite removed his heavy robes. He was frail, his body scarred by centuries of war and dark arts. He climbed into the seat. Oppenheimer protested. He said the dampeners were untested. Malcador smiled that dry, dusty smile. He said he had held harder things than a machine. He strapped himself in. Oppenheimer activated the sequence. The throne roared. The gold plating heated up. The blackstone wafers began to hum, a low, discordant note that made the teeth vibrate. Malcador gasped. His back arched. The psychic lightning arced, but this time it didn't explode. It hit the blackstone and dissipated. The wafers absorbed the feedback, glowing with a sickly violet light. The gate opened. It was stable. The tunnel was clear. The Emperor nodded to Oppenheimer. He picked up his sword and walked into the light. He was gone. Malcador held the throne. Oppenheimer watched the readouts. The Sigillite's vitals were dropping. The machine was drinking him. The blackstone was working, but it wasn't enough. It was filtering the spike, but the constant drain was immense. Oppenheimer realized the flaw in his design. The throne wasn't just a projector. It was a vampire. It needed life force to maintain the cohesion of the beam. The blackstone prevented the explosion, but it increased the metabolic cost. To keep the gate open, the pilot had to burn. For 3 days the Emperor worked in the webway. For 3 days Malcador sat in the chair. Oppenheimer did not leave the console. He adjusted the flow, micromanaging the agony of the regent. He fed stimulants into Malcador's veins. He routed power from the palace grid to ease the burden. It wasn't enough. Malcador was dying. His skin turned grey. His eyes bled. On the 3rd day, the Emperor returned. He stepped out of the gate, his armor covered in the blood of diamonds. He looked exhausted. He pulled Malcador from the chair. The connection broke. The gate flickered but stayed partially open, held by the residual charge. Malcador was unconscious, his pulse a thread. The Emperor laid a hand on the Sigillite's chest, infusing him with golden light. Malcador gasped, life returning to him, but he was diminished. A piece of him had been left in the machine. The Emperor turned to Oppenheimer. He asked for the report. Oppenheimer showed him the data. The blackstone worked, but it degraded quickly. It saturated. Once it was full of warp energy, it cracked, and the cost to the user was exponential. Oppenheimer said the machine was sustainable only for short bursts. For long-term use, for a permanent gate, it would require a battery of souls. The Emperor looked at the throne. He looked at the golden machinery that was meant to liberate humanity. He understood the implication immediately. To keep the road open, thousands would have to die. Not in battle, but in a cold, industrial process of extraction. Oppenheimer saw the calculation behind the Emperor's eyes. It was the same calculation he had seen in Perturabo, in Malcador, in himself. The utilitarian calculus, the greater good. Fix the saturation issue, the Emperor commanded. The cost is acceptable. Oppenheimer froze. Acceptable. He looked at the machine. He had built a furnace, and now he was being told to shovel people into it. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to throw down his slate and quit, but he knew the alternative. Without the webway, humanity was doomed to the warp. They were doomed to the slow corruption of the chaos gods. The Rangdan had shown him that. The universe was a slaughterhouse. The only choice was who held the knife. He went back to work. He redesigned the regulator. He added a secondary intake manifold. It was designed to accept external psychic inputs. Auxiliary capacitors, he called them in the blueprints. In reality, they were sarcophagi, pods where lesser psychers could be hooked in, their energy drained to buffer the primary user. It was a chain reaction of suffering. One main pilot to steer, 1,000 batteries to burn. The work took another year. The unification of the webway was progressing, but the galaxy outside was darkening. Reports came from the expeditionary fleets. Horus had been named War Master. Tensions were rising. The word-bearers had been chastised. The world-eaters were butchering entire populations. The Imperium was cracking, and in the dungeon the pressure grew. The warp was pushing back harder against the webway. The Chaos Gods knew what the Emperor was doing. They were scratching at the walls of the tunnel. One night, a containment breach occurred in Sector 9 of the dungeon. A swarm of Psychnuan, warp wasps, phased through a weak point in the shielding. They were small, but deadly. They laid eggs in the brains of the workers. Panic erupted. The custodian guard moved in, their guardian spears flashing. Oppenheimer was caught in the crossfire. He was armed only with a las pistol he kept for self-defense. He saw a worker, a man he had shared coffee with, fall to his knees, clawing at his eyes as the larvae hatched. Oppenheimer fired. The laser burned a hole in the man's head. It was a mercy. He fired again and again, killing the infected before the wasps could spread. He was efficient. He was cold. He reached the containment seal and slammed the emergency lockdown, trapping himself and 20 survivors inside with the remaining wasps. He overrode the ventilation system. He flooded the sector with Hullen gas. It killed the wasps. It also suffocated the survivors. When the custodians cut through the door an hour later, they found Oppenheimer sitting on the floor, wearing his rebreather. The 20 men and women around him were dead. The wasps were dead. The breach was sealed. The custodian captain looked at him. He didn't raise his weapon. He simply nodded. Strategic expenditure, the custodian said. Oppenheimer stood up. He walked past the bodies. He didn't feel sick anymore. He didn't feel the guilt. He felt a cold, hard numbness. He had become the machine. He had become the regulator. He reported to the Emperor that the breach was contained. He requested a new batch of workers. He requested more Blackstone. The project entered its final phase. The Golden Throne was now a massive complex. The auxiliary capacitors were installed, rows of coffin-like pods lining the base of the pyramid. The first batch of fuel arrived. They were prisoners, rogue psychers, mutants. They were dragged screaming into the dungeon. Oppenheimer watched them being loaded into the pods. He checked the connections. He ensured the flow rates were optimal. He watched the life drain out of a young woman's eyes on his monitor. Her soul became a graph. Her pain became a stable voltage. He had solved the problem. The throne was stable. The webway was holding. But he had created a monster. He realized that this machine would never stop eating. Even if the webway was finished, the throne would need to be maintained. It would need to be fed. He had built an eternal engine of sacrifice. Then came the message that changed everything. A psionic message, not meant for him, but so powerful it bled into every mind on Terra. It was a warning. It was a scream. It came from the Prospero system. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. He was trying to warn his father. He was projecting his astral form across the galaxy. He was smashing through the protections of the Imperial Palace. Oppenheimer was at the console when the warning hit. The psychic ward to the palace shattered. The alarms screamed. The golden throne flared white-hot. The delicate blackstone wafers he had spent years grinding shattered in an instant. The spiral lattice collapsed. The webway gate, held open by the Emperor's will and Oppenheimer's machine, was forced wide open. But it wasn't the webway anymore. The force of Magnus's arrival had punched a hole through the wall of the tunnel. The warp rushed in. Demons, pure and unadulterated, poured into the webway. The Emperor was thrown back into the throne room. The psychic backlash killed every technician in the room. Oppenheimer was thrown against the wall. His ribs cracked. He looked up through the smoke. The gate was a swirling vortex of madness. Shapes were moving in the fire. The Emperor stood before the gate, his sword igniting. He was holding back an ocean of hell. He shouted a command. The switch. Oppenheimer. The isolation switch. Oppenheimer crawled. His leg was broken. He dragged himself across the floor. The isolation switch was a manual cutoff he had installed as a last resort. It would sever the throne from the webway, collapsing the gate. It would strand the webway project, but it would stop the demons from spilling onto Terra. It was the end of the dream. It was the end of the hope for humanity. He reached the lever. It was heavy brass. He grabbed it with both hands. He looked at the Emperor. The master of mankind was fighting an impossible war, holding the breach with his mind and his sword. He looked at Oppenheimer. There was no command in his eyes now, only sorrow. Oppenheimer pulled the lever. Nothing happened. The mechanism was jammed. The heat had fused the gears. The chain reaction he had feared was here. The energy was too great. The machine refused to stop. Oppenheimer screamed in frustration. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor. He smashed it against the locking mechanism. Once, twice. The metal groaned. The demons were pushing through. He could hear their laughter. It sounded like the voices from Jupiter. It sounded like the Rangdan scream. He hit it a third time. The lock shattered. He threw his weight against the lever. It slammed down. The throne groaned. The connection was severed, not fully, but enough. The gate didn't close, but the aperture shrank. The flood of demons was stemmed to a trickle. The Emperor stepped forward, his golden light filling the breach, becoming the living door. He was now the only thing standing between Terra and the warp. The machine could no longer hold it alone. It needed him. Oppenheimer lay on the floor. He watched the Emperor sit on the golden throne. He watched the master of mankind interface with the damaged, hungry machine. He saw the Emperor flinch as the needles drove into his spine. He saw the golden light dim as the throne began to drain him. The project was dead. The webway was breached. And Oppenheimer had just helped build the prison that would hold the Emperor for eternity. He closed his eyes. He wished the radiation would finally kill him. But it didn't. He was too useful. Malcador was already moving towards him, shouting for medics. There was work to be done. The throne was broken. It needed to be fixed. The war was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the next 10 seconds. And then the next. Forever. Oppenheimer let out a breath that rattled in his ruined chest. I am become death, he whispered to the stone floor, and I cannot stop. The alarms blared on, signaling the start of the Horus Heresy. The dream was over. The nightmare had begun. The war for the solar system had been raging for 5 years, but it was only now that the sky above Terra began to change color. It was no longer the grey of industrial smog or the black of the void. It was a bruised purple. The warp was bleeding into real space. The traitor fleets of Horus Lupercal had broken the Beta Garmin cluster. They were inside the walls. Robert Oppenheimer stood on the ramparts of the ultimate gate. He did not look at the sky. He looked at his data slate. The atmospheric ionization levels were rising. The sheer psychic weight of the approaching traitor armada was pressing down on the planet like a physical thumb. He turned and walked back into the sanctum. He walked with a cane now. His left leg was useless, the nerves burned out by the proximity to the golden throne. He wore a containment suit of heavy rubber and lead under his robes. It did not help. He could feel the radiation of the Emperor's psychic agony itching in his teeth. He descended into the dungeon. The air here was hot and dry. It smelled of ozone and incense. The screaming had stopped. In the early days, the sacrificed psychers had screamed. Now, the process was automated. Oppenheimer had designed the injectors himself. A cocktail of paralytics and stimulants was administered the moment the pod closed. The fuel did not need to scream to burn. He reached the control dais. The golden throne had grown. It was no longer just a chair. It was a cathedral of machinery that filled the entire cavern. Cables thick as ancient trees pulsed with golden light, feeding into the central figure. The Emperor sat motionless. His skin was the color of old parchment. His eyes were closed. His mouth was a rictus of concentration. He was fighting a war in the webway that no one else could see. He was holding a door shut against an ocean of monsters, and he was losing. Malcador was waiting for him. The Sigillite was fading. He was translucent, a ghost held together by will. He pointed to the primary monitor. The power fluctuations were erratic. The throne was shaking. The Emperor's focus was slipping. Every time the War Master's fleet destroyed a loyalist ship in the outer system, a ripple of death screamed through the warp and hit the Emperor like a hammer. Oppenheimer looked at the schematics. The problem was throughput. The throne was eating the psychers too fast. The batteries were burning out in hours instead of days. The ashes were clogging the intake vents. The Mechanicum adepts were working around the clock to clear the filters, scraping human residue out of the holy machinery with silver trowels. It was inefficient. If the intake clogged during the siege, the field would flicker. If the field flickered, the demons would spill out onto Terra. Oppenheimer proposed a solution. It was a small change in the engineering. A bypass valve. Instead of filtering the residue, they would incinerate it within the plasma loop. It would increase the thermal output of the throne by 10%. It would make the throne room uninhabitable for unaugmented humans. But it would prevent the clogs. It meant that the souls were not just drained, they were obliterated. There would be no remains to bury. Malcador looked at the design. He looked at the Emperor writhing in silent pain. He nodded. The modification took 2 days. Oppenheimer worked alongside the Fabricator General's envoy. They welded the new conduits in place. The heat was unbearable. Oppenheimer's skin blistered. He did not stop. When they activated the bypass, the throne roared. A vent opened high above, spewing a column of black smoke into the cavern roof. The smoke smelled of nothing. It was clean. The efficiency rating stabilized. The Emperor's breathing eased. Oppenheimer had bought them time. But time was running out. The news came from the Phalanx. The traitor fleet had bypassed the defenses at Pluto. The Alpha Legion had sown confusion in the sensor grid. The Sol system was burning. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, summoned Oppenheimer to the Bub Bastion. The meeting was brief. Dawn stood over a hololith of the palace. He looked tired. His golden armor was scratched. He did not look at Oppenheimer with the suspicion he once held. He looked at him as a fellow Mason. Dawn asked a single question. He asked if the throne could be weaponized. Oppenheimer blinked. He asked for clarification. Dawn pointed to the approaching fleet. He said that if the wars failed, if the Eternity Gate was breached, He needed a final option. He did not want to hand the throne to Horus. He did not want the seat of the master of mankind to become a throne of skulls for a chaos god. He wanted a scorched earth policy. He wanted a kill switch. Oppenheimer returned to the dungeon. He sat before his desk. He lit a glow stick. His hands trembled. He thought about the bomb he had built in the desert. That bomb had been a weapon of war. This request was different. This was a weapon of extinction. If he rigged the throne to overload, the resulting psychic backlash would not just destroy the palace. It would ignite the atmosphere of terror. It would create a warp rift that would swallow the Sol system. It would kill the Emperor. It would kill humanity's cradle. But it would deny the enemy their prize. He began to draw. He did not use a cogitator. He used paper and ink. He drew the talisman. It was a device he had theorized about with Vulkan years ago. It was a dead man switch connected to the Golden Throne's core. It required a specific harmonic code to activate. Once activated, it would reverse the flow of the throne. Instead of pulling energy from the warp to hold the webway shut, it would pull the entire material mass of Terra into the warp and detonate it. He worked in secret. He did not trust the Mechanicum. The tech priests would view this as the ultimate heresy. To destroy the Omnissiah's greatest work was unthinkable. Oppenheimer worked alone in the maintenance crawl spaces. He installed the sensors. He wired the detonator into the Emperor's life support monitor. The trigger condition was simple. If the Emperor's heart stopped for more than 10 beats, the sequence would arm. He finished the installation on the day the bombardment of Terra began. The ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling of the dungeon. The lights flickered. Oppenheimer sat by the console, watching the Emperor. The master of mankind knew. He had to know. He was sitting on a nuclear mine. Yet he said nothing. He trusted the physicist to know when to pull the trigger. Then came the second crisis. The supply of psychers was cut off. The black ships could no longer break orbit to hunt. The traitor blockade was absolute. The dungeons held a reserve of 10,000. At the current burn rate, that was a month of fuel. If the siege lasted longer than a month, the fire would go out. Oppenheimer went to the holding cells. He walked among the condemned. They were huddled in the dark, muttering prayers or screaming at unseen demons. He looked at them, not as people, but as jewels of energy. He needed more power. He needed to stretch the supply. He made a choice. It was a logistical choice, a small adjustment to the extraction protocol. Until now, they had been using the psychers until their brain activity ceased. But there was residual energy in the body even after brain death. The soul clung to the flesh for a few minutes. If they increased the extraction intensity, they could rip that last shred of energy out. It would be excruciating. It would be a violation of every law of nature, but it would increase the yield by 20%. He typed the command into the control slate. He rewrote the code for the extraction coffins. He did not ask Malcador. He did not ask Dawn. He simply did it. The next batch of prisoners was loaded. The machine activated. The screaming was different this time. It was shorter, but higher pitched. It was the sound of a spirit being torn from its anchor. The power levels on the throne jumped. The reserve estimate extended by a week. Oppenheimer rubbed his eyes. He had just tortured 10,000 people to buy 7 days. He told himself it was math, just math. The siege dragged on. The walls of the palace were being ground to dust. The spaceport was lost. The Lion's Gate fell. The traitors were landing titans on the surface. The ground shook constantly. In the dungeon, the shaking caused the delicate blackstone wafers to crack. Oppenheimer had to replace them by hand, crawling inside the active machinery while the radiation burned his skin. One night, or what passed for the night, A visitor arrived. It was not a soldier. It was a woman in gold armor, but she had no soul. It was Janisha Kroll, the Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood. She was a blank. Her presence made Oppenheimer nauseous. To stand near her was to feel like you were standing next to a gaping hole in reality. She did not speak. She used hand signs. She signaled that the psychic noise of the war was becoming too loud. The diamonds were pressing against the physical walls of the dungeon. They were whispering to the technicians. 3 servitors had clawed their own faces off in the last hour. She offered her sisters. She offered them as living shields. Oppenheimer looked to the throne. The Emperor was sweating blood. The warp was leaking in. Oppenheimer realized that he could use the sisters, not as guards, but as components. If he wired a blank into the grounding circuit, it would create a zone of absolute silence around the core. It would stabilize the Emperor's concentration. But the energy flowing through the blank would be lethal. It would burn out their null soul just as the warp burned out the psychers. He explained this to Kroll. He drew a diagram. He showed her that her sisters would be batteries of negative energy. They would be consumed. Kroll looked at the diagram. She looked at the Emperor. She signed a single word. Duty. She stepped into the modification chamber. Oppenheimer hooked her armor into the grounding port. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Respect. He activated the circuit. Kroll gasped. She did not scream. She stood rigid as the psychic lightning of the Emperor's agony was routed through her body. The air in the room instantly cleared. The whispers stopped. The static vanished. The Emperor's face relaxed for the first time in months. The blank was acting as a heatsink for the madness. Oppenheimer watched the bio readings. Kroll was dying. Her nervous system was being erased. She would last 6 hours. Then another sister would have to take her place. Oppenheimer updated the logistic spreadsheet. Asset. Silent Sisters. Usage rate. 4 per day. He closed the file. He had just turned the Emperor's most loyal guards into fuse wires. Their endgame approached. The traitors had breached the ultimate gate. The Khan was riding out to die. Sanguinius was holding the Eternity Gate alone. The noise of the battle could be heard even in the dungeon. The blast door shook. Malcador came to Oppenheimer. He was carrying a helm. He was going to join the Emperor on the Vengeful Spirit. The Emperor had decided to teleport to Horus's flagship. He was going to end the war personally. This created the final problem. If the Emperor left the throne, the gate would open. Terror would fall. Someone had to sit in the chair. Someone had to hold the door. Malcador said he would do it. He knew it would kill him. He knew he would not survive the transfer. Oppenheimer looked at the Sigillite. He looked at the frail old man who had been the architect of the Imperium. He grabbed Malcador's arm. He told him about the talisman. He told him about the bomb. He told him that if he sat on the throne and his heart failed, the system would detonate. Malcador smiled. He reached into his robe and pulled out a data wafer. He handed it to Oppenheimer. He said he knew. He said the Emperor knew. He told Oppenheimer that the talisman was not just a bomb. It was a choice. If the Emperor failed, if Horus won, Oppenheimer was to manually trigger the device. He was to be the final judge of humanity. Malcador ascended the dais. The tech priest began the rite of transfer. The Emperor opened his eyes. He looked at Malcador. A silent exchange passed between them. A farewell. Then the Emperor stood. The machinery screamed. The psychic weight slammed into the room. Malcador threw himself onto the seat. The needles drove into his flesh. He cried out, his body arching. The Emperor vanished in a flash of teleportation light. Oppenheimer stood alone at the console. Malcador was burning. His skin was turning to ash. readout showed his life force plummeting. The throne was eating him alive. Oppenheimer watched the timer. The teleport assault would take time. Malcador didn't have time. The blast doors to the dungeon groaned. Someone was cutting through. The traitors were here. Oppenheimer pulled his last pistol. He checked the charge. He looked at the talisman trigger. It was a large red rune on his console. He placed his hand over it. The doors blew inward. Dust and smoke filled the entryway. A squad of traitors charged in. They were not space marines. They were cultists, men and women with symbols carved into their flesh. They were screaming praises to the dark gods. Oppenheimer fired. He hit the lead cultist in the throat. The man fell. More poured in. Behind them, a shape loomed in the smoke. A space marine of the Sons of Horus. His armor was sea green and covered in spikes. He revved a chain axe. He saw Oppenheimer. He saw the frail man in the grey robe standing between him and the golden throne. The traitor laughed. Oppenheimer didn't move. He kept his hand on the red rune. He shouted at the marine. He told him to look at the console. He told him what the rune did. He spoke with the cold authority of a man who had calculated the yield of the apocalypse. The marine stopped. He looked at the rune. He looked at the readout. He saw the seismic charges rigged to the planetary core. He saw the truth. If he took one more step, the physicist would kill them all. The marine hesitated. That hesitation saved the throne. A blur of gold flashed from the shadows. Valdor, the captain general of the Custodes, had not left. He had been waiting. His guardian spear swept out, decapitating the marine. The custodians emerged from their hidden alcoves. They slaughtered the cultists in seconds. It was a wet, brutal work. Valdor walked up to Oppenheimer. He looked at the red rune. He looked at Oppenheimer's hand hovering over it. He did not thank him. He simply took a position at the foot of the throne. He was ready to die to protect the ashes of Malcador. The hours passed. Malcador was a skeleton wrapped in lightning. Oppenheimer injected stimulants directly into the Sigillite's neck. It was like watering a dead plant. Then the psychic backlash hit. A wave of sorrow so profound it brought Oppenheimer to his knees. The Emperor had struck the blow. Horus was dead, but the Emperor was fallen. The teleportation flare lit up the room. Rogel Dawn appeared. He was carrying the broken body of the Emperor. The master of mankind was a ruin. His armor was shattered. His arm was gone. His face was a mask of blood. Dawn ran to the throne. He pulled the charred remains of Malcador from the seat. Malcador crumbled into dust as he hit the floor. His service was done. Dawn lifted the Emperor. He placed his father on the golden throne. The machinery engaged. The interface needles sought purchase in the broken flesh. The Emperor gasped. A sound of pure agony. The golden light flared, but it was dim. It was flickering. Oppenheimer watched the biomonitor. The Emperor was dying. His cells were failing. The throne wasn't healing him. It was keeping him in a state of permanent, agonizing arrest. It was a life support system for a corpse. Dawn turned to Oppenheimer. He was weeping. He screamed at the physicist. "Fix him! Do something!" Oppenheimer looked at the data. He saw the two paths. Path A. He could attempt to decouple the stasis field, allowing the Emperor to die and perhaps be reborn as a perpetual, as the legend suggested. But in that moment of death, the webway would open. Terra would be consumed. The talisman would have to be triggered. Humanity would lose its home, but the Emperor might live. Path B. He could lock the stasis field. He could freeze the Emperor in this moment of dying. The throne would sustain his consciousness to hold the gate, but his body would rot. He would be trapped in an eternal second of torture. He would never heal. He would never speak. He would be a lighthouse fueled by his own suffering. But Terra would stand. The Imperium would survive. It was the choice, the small choice, to save the man or to save the work. Oppenheimer looked at the ruin of the Emperor. He remembered the voice in the desert. I am become death. He realized he wasn't death. He was the jailer. He reached out. He did not press the red rune of the talisman. He pressed the blue rune, the stasis lock. The throne slammed shut. The temporal field engaged. The Emperor's body arched, frozen in the climax of his pain. The golden light stabilized. It became hard and cold. The gate was held. The demons were locked out. Dawn fell to his knees. He thought Oppenheimer had saved him. Oppenheimer knew the truth. He had just sentenced the Emperor to a fate worse than hell. He had turned a god into a battery. He stepped back from the console. The output was steady. The consumption of souls stabilized at 1,000 per day. The math worked. The equation was balanced. Oppenheimer felt a terrible weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He had saved the world, and all it cost was everything. He walked past Dawn. He walked past the custodians. He walked out of the dungeon. He emerged into the ruins of the palace. The sun was rising through the smoke. It was a grey, ash-choked dawn. He sat on a piece of fallen marble. He took out his last low stick. He lit it. He took a drag. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. They would never stop shaking. He had built the bomb. He had built the engine. And now he had built the coffin. The age of the Imperium had begun, and Robert Oppenheimer was its architect. The years turned into decades. The decades turned into a century. The dust of the siege had long since settled, burying the dead under layers of grey ash and black snow. Terra was rebuilding, but it was not the terror of the unification. It was a necropolis. The Imperial Palace had ceased to be a fortress and had become a temple. The gargoyles on the walls were no longer decorative. They were fashioned in the likeness of the martyrs who had died holding the Eternity Gate. Incense smoke was thicker than the smog had ever been. It choked the ventilation shafts. It coated the marble floors in a greasy, perfumed film. Robert Oppenheimer sat in a wheelchair made of plasteel and ivory. He was old, impossibly old. His body was a wreckage of biology, held together by the finest rejuvenate treatments the Adeptus Mechanicus could provide. He had refused the full bionic conversion, but they had taken liberties while he slept. His left eye was gone, replaced by a multispectral sensor that glowed a soft, baleful red. His lungs were synthetic, pumping with a rhythmic wheeze that sounded like a bellows. His hands, the hands that had drawn the elliptical coils and the stasis locks, were skeletal claws, spotted with liver cancer and radiation burns. He could no longer hold the stylus. He dictated his equations to a floating servo skull that had once been the head of his favorite lab assistant. He was the master of the Astronomicon now. That was the title the nascent High Lords of Terra had given him. It was a political title. In reality, he was the custodian of the fire. He spent his days in the Hollow Mountain, monitoring the psychic beacon that guided the Imperial ships through the warp. The Golden Throne was the anchor, but the Astronomicon was the lighthouse. It required a choir of 10,000 trained psychers, singing a telepathic song into the void until their brains burned out. Oppenheimer managed the rotation. He managed the disposal of the husks. He managed the efficiency of the soul furnace. The Imperium was changing around him. The secular truth of the Emperor was dead. In its place, the Lactatio Divinitatus was spreading like a virus. People did not speak of logic. They spoke of faith. They did not trust in walls. They trusted in miracles. Oppenheimer hated it. He hated the priests who walked the corridors in their heavy robes, swinging censers and chanting prayers to the God Emperor. He wanted to scream at them. He wanted to tell them that the man on the chair was not a god. He was a scientist who had failed. He was a warlord who had lost. But Oppenheimer remained silent. His voice was a rasp, and no one listened to the architect of ash anymore. They only wanted him to keep the lights on. The crisis of the 32nd millennium was not an invasion. It was an entropy. The knowledge was fading. The tech priests who had built the throne with him were dead. Their successors were lesser men. They did not understand the principles of psychic engineering. They only knew the rites. They treated the maintenance manuals as holy scripture. If a pressure valve needed to be turned, they did not turn it because the gauge read high. They turned it because the psalm of the valve dictated it be turned at the third toll of the bell. Oppenheimer watched this devolution with a growing horror. He realized that when he died, the understanding of the machine would die with him. The Imperium would be left with a nuclear reactor that they thought was a magic altar. It was a recipe for catastrophe. He summoned the Fabricator General. The meeting took place in the observation gallery overlooking the throne room. The Fabricator General was a monster of brass and mechadendrites. He was barely human. He moved on tank treads. His voice was a screech of binary static translated by a voxbox. He demanded to know why the flesh servant had summoned him. He was busy cataloguing the archaeotech recovered from the scouring of the traitor legions. Oppenheimer spoke. He asked the fabricator to explain the function of the secondary cooling loop on the throne. The fabricator hesitated. He recited a prayer. He said the loop was the tears of the Omnissiah, meant to wash away the heat of the Emperor's burden. Oppenheimer stopped him. He asked for the physics. He asked for the thermal expansion coefficient of the coolant. The fabricator was silent. He did not know. He had never known. He had only known that the coolant must flow. Oppenheimer closed his single organic eye. The realization was absolute. Science was dead. The Crusade had killed it. The heresy had buried it. And now, the survival of the species depended on ritual. If he tried to teach them physics now, they would call it heresy. They would burn him. And then they would blow up the throne trying to appease it. He made a decision. It was the most painful decision of his life. More painful than the bomb. More painful than the stasis lock. He decided to destroy the science. He decided to codify the ignorance. If they wanted a religion, he would write them a Bible. But it would be a Bible that worked. He would translate the maintenance schedule of the Golden Throne into a catechism. He would turn the safety checks into prayers. He would hide the instructions in the dogma. He began the great work. It took him 5 years. He sat in his ivory chair, dictating to a team of scribe servitors. He wrote the Librum Excommunicus. It was a massive tome, bound in the skin of the first failed Pesca choir. In it, he wrote the procedures. He wrote, "Thou shalt not touch the coil of the inner circle, for it is the halo of the divine, and to touch it is to invite the fire." Translation: the inner coil is unshielded high voltage. Do not touch. He wrote, "When the machine spirit sings the song of the angry hornet, thou must anoint the bearing with the sacred oil of viscosity." Translation: if the bearing buzzes, apply heavy grease. He wrote, "The Emperor demands the tithe of the soul be pure. Reject the mutant who carries the shadow of the rock." Translation: do not use psychers with geological instability in their gene seed. They clog the filters. He wrote it all. Every procedure, every emergency protocol, every disastrous error. He turned it all into myth. He cemented the stagnation. He knew that by doing this, he was ensuring that humanity would never advance again. They would never build a better throne. They would never fix the webway. They would be trapped in this technological stasis forever. But they would survive. They would be able to follow the instructions without understanding them. It was the ultimate act of cynicism. It was the ultimate act of love. As he neared the end of the book, the political pressure on Terra shifted. The High Lords were solidifying their power. The Inquisition was forming. Men in black leather coats with the rosettes of crimson were asking questions. They wanted to know about the talisman. They had found references to it in Malcador's fragmented archives. They knew there was a weapon buried in the throne. They wanted it. They wanted the power to destroy the planet, not to use it, but to hold it, to threaten their enemies. Oppenheimer refused to see them. He locked himself in the control tower. He had the custodian guard bar the doors. The Captain General, a warrior named Valoris, who had succeeded Valdor, honored the old man's request. The custodians remembered. They remembered who had stood with them when the demons came. They stood guard in their gold armor, crossing their spears before the inquisitorial agents. "The architect is working," they said. "Do not disturb the silence." But the inquisitors were persistent. They cut the power to the tower. The lights died. The air scrubbers stopped. Oppenheimer sat in the dark, illuminated only by the glow of the golden throne below. He kept working. He wrote by the light of the dying god. He finished the book. He called for Valoris. The Captain General entered the darkened room. He looked at the frail figure in the wheelchair. Oppenheimer handed him the book. He told him to give it to the Fabricator General. He told him to say that this was the final revelation. He told him to enforce its use. The Mechanicus was never to deviate from these scriptures, not by a single word. Valoris took the heavy tome. He looked at the title. He looked at Oppenheimer. "Is this truth?" the custodian asked. "It is survival," Oppenheimer whispered. "Truth is a luxury we can no longer afford." Valoris nodded and left. Oppenheimer was alone. He looked at the red rune on his console. The talisman of 7 hammers. The dead man's switch. The Inquisitors were drilling through the blast doors now. He could hear the melter cutters hissing. They would break in. They would torture him. They would extract the activation code. They would take the bomb and use it as a political lever. Oppenheimer knew what he had to do. He could not let them have the bomb, but he could not disarm it either. The Emperor might still fail. The throne might still crack. If that happened, the bomb had to go off. It was the only way to close the Eye of Terror that would form if Terra fell. He had to change the lock. He had to make himself the key, not his body, his mind. He wheeled himself to the interface port. It was the same port Malcador had used. It was the same port the Emperor used. He picked up a neural jack cable. It was thick and oily. He looked at the connector. It was designed for a demigod. It would burn a human brain to ash in seconds. But Oppenheimer didn't need seconds. He needed a microsecond. He typed a command into the talisman's logic engine. He set the activation code to a biometric constant. He keyed it to his own neural pattern, but not a static pattern, a dynamic one, the pattern of his dying thought. To activate the bomb, one would need to recreate the exact electrical impulse of Robert Oppenheimer's brain at the moment of his death. It was a cipher that could never be cracked, because the key would cease to exist the moment it was used. The blast doors gave way with a crash of falling metal. The Inquisitors stormed in. They were led by a man named Lord Veritas. He carried a force staff. He looked at Oppenheimer. "Secure the heretic," Veritas shouted. "Secure the device." Oppenheimer smiled. It was a sad, tired smile. He looked at the golden throne one last time. He saw the Emperor, the corpse god, the prisoner. He wondered if the Emperor was watching him. He wondered if the master of mankind understood that his greatest scientist was about to commit the ultimate act of defiance. "I am become death," Oppenheimer said, his voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength. "And the destroyer of worlds is already here." He jammed the neural jack into the socket at the base of his skull. The connection was instant. 1,billion volts of psychic energy, filtered through the agony of the Emperor, slammed into Oppenheimer's mind. It wasn't pain. Pain was too small a word. It was obliteration. He saw the universe. He saw the warp. He saw the laughter of the dark gods. He saw the timeline of humanity stretching out like a fraying rope. He saw the 10,000 years of darkness to come. He saw the Inquisition burning innocent worlds. He saw the Space Marines turning into feudal warlords. He saw the ecclesiarchy selling salvation for coin. He saw it all, and he did not flinch. He grabbed the logic core of the talisman within the datasphere. He fused it to his soul. He locked it with his final breath. The code was set. The bomb was armed, but it was dormant. It would wait. It would wait until the throne failed completely. And when it did, it would look for Oppenheimer, find him missing, and detonate. It was a dead man's switch that spanned eternity. His heart stopped. His brain boiled. The servo skull hovered over him, recording the flat line. The red light in his mechanical eye faded. Robert Oppenheimer slumped forward in his ivory chair, the cable still pulsing with golden light, connecting him to the machine he had served, saved, and damned. Veritas rushed forward. He ripped the cable from the corpse's skull. Sparks flew. He checked the console. The talisman was locked. The access code was a string of nonsense. A complex, chaotic equation that no cogitator could solve. Veritas screamed in rage. He struck the corpse with his staff. The body of the physicist fell to the floor, fragile as a bird. But the deed was done. The weapon was beyond their reach. The manual was in the hands of the custodes. The path was set. The aftermath was quiet. There was no state funeral for Robert Oppenheimer. The High Lords did not want to draw attention to the man who had defied them. They erased his name from the public records. He became a myth, a footnote in the history of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They called him the Builder. They said he was a saint who had been taken by the Emperor into the light. His body was not buried. The Mechanicus claimed it. They argued that his cybernetics were holy relics. They stripped the meat from his bones. They plated his skull in gold and set it in a reliquary inside the Eternity Gate. They did not know that the skull was just bone. They did not know that the real man was the code buried deep in the logic stacks of the throne. The years passed. The millennia passed. The Imperium calcified. The Librum Excommunicus became the Book of the Engine. Tech priests would chant Oppenheimer's safety warnings as hymns during the Feast of the Cog. They would anoint the valves with sacred oil, weeping with religious ecstasy, unaware that they were just performing a standard lubrication cycle. The Golden Throne continued to hunger. The black ships brought their tithe, 10,000 souls a day, a genocide of the gifted to keep the candle burning. The Astronomicon shone across the galaxy, a beacon of light in a universe of horror. Ships navigated by it. Worlds lived and died by it. In the 41st millennium, the throne began to fail again. The cracks that Oppenheimer had patched with blackstone and blood began to widen. The tears of the Omnissiah coolant system began to leak. The tech priests panicked. They consulted the book. They read the passage. In the time of the breaking, seek the echo of the builder. They did not know what it meant. They thought it meant they should pray harder. But deep in the machine, in the cold, dark logic gates, where the talisman slept, a ghost was watching. The digital echo of Oppenheimer's consciousness, trapped in the loop of the locking mechanism, observed the decay. He felt the Emperor's soul shredding. He felt the laughter of the Chaos Gods getting louder. He was tired. He had been holding the trigger for 10,000 years. He watched as a new figure approached the throne. It was a Primarch returned. Robert Guilliman, the avenging son. He stood before the rotting carcass of his father. He wore the armor of fate. He looked at the machinery with the eyes of a statesman, not a priest. He saw the inefficiency. He saw the horror. Guilliman summoned the new fabricator general, Cool. He demanded to know how the throne worked. Cool admitted he did not fully know. He said the knowledge was lost. He said the builder had left only riddles. Guilliman looked at the golden skull in the reliquary. He felt a strange resonance. He felt the weight of a choice made long ago. He touched the interface panel. For a second, the systems flickered. A line of text scrolled across the oldest monitor in the room, a monitor that hadn't worked in centuries. It was text in a language no one spoke anymore. Old English. The light is not the salvation. The light is the cage. Guilliman stared at the words. The monitor died. The avenging son understood. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was a prison, and the jailer was still on duty. The chronicle ends here, not with a bang, but with the hum of a dying machine. The galaxy is a dark place. There is only war. And in the center of it all, a bomb waits for a heart to stop beating. The legacy of Oppenheimer was not the fire he brought. It was the fire he held back. He had given humanity the most terrible gift of all, existence without hope. He had bought them time, but he had sold their future. And as the Golden Throne consumed another 1,000 souls, the ghost in the machine whispered the only truth that remained. It works. It works. God help us. It works. The screen fades to black. The fan hum of the cogitators is the only sound. The record is sealed. The data stack labeled Archaeocrypt 902 had remained sealed for 6,000 years. Inside the vault, the air was stagnant and dry, preserved at a temperature of exactly 0 degrees to halt the decay of the holy parchments. A single servo skull drifted through the gloom, its anti-grav motor whining with a sound like a dying insect. It was cataloguing. The Imperium of the 41st millennium was a civilization of hoarders, terrified of throwing away anything that might contain a scrap of the old truths. The skull hovered over a glass case in the center of the room. Inside lay a pair of spectacles. They were simple, round lenses framed in wire. To the modern eye, they were garbage. To the cult mechanicus, they were a relic of the Primus architect. The skull scanned the object. It recorded the item as the eyes of the builder. It noted the microscopic fractures in the glass. It noted the radiation signature that still clung to the wire, a faint, ghostly isotope from a desert test site 30,000 years and half a galaxy away. Deep above the crypt, in the sweating, thrumming heart of the Sanctum Imperialis, Tech Adept Hestia 7 performed the ritual of the graphite. She stood on a gantry suspended over the secondary reactor pool of the Golden Throne. The heat was enough to boil water, but her robes were woven from asbestos and prayer strips. In her mechadendrites, she held a long black rod. She did not know that it was a neutron moderator rod made of industrial-grade graphite. She believed it was a staff of silencing, a holy totem that quieted the anger of the machine spirit. She consulted the heavy book chained to her waist. It was a copy of a copy of a copy of the Book of the Engine. The ink was faded. The handwriting was a jagged scrawl. She read the passage aloud, her voice amplified by a vox grill. The text read, "When the blue light pulses, insert the rod to the third mark. Do not force it. If it jams, the core is swelling. Vent the pressure." Hestia 7 did not read it as instructions. She chanted it as a psalm. She sang to the reactor. She spoke of the blue light of judgment and the rod of mercy. She lowered the graphite into the port. It slid in smoothly. The roaring hum of the reactor dropped an octave. The red warning lights on the console flickered and died, replaced by a steady green. Hestia 7 wept oil from her optical sensors. The miracle had happened again. The machine was appeased. She did not know she had just prevented a criticality accident using basic nuclear physics. She only knew that the builder watched over them. In the hallway outside the throne room, a pilgrim stood before a massive mural. It depicted the Siege of Terra. In the center was the Emperor, glowing like a sun. To his right stood Rogel Dawn, the Golden Wall. To his left stood a figure in grey robes, his face shadowed, holding a set of scales. In one pan of the scales was a planet. In the other was a single human heart. The pilgrim asked a passing priest who the grey figure was. The priest smiled benevolently. He said that was Saint Robert of the Sands. He was the one who taught the Emperor how to weigh the sins of the galaxy. He said Saint Robert had built a cage for death itself and locked himself inside it to keep the monsters away. The pilgrim nodded, making the sign of the Aquila. He did not know that the cage was not for death, but for the Emperor, and that the lock was made of guilt. Far below them all, in the logic stacks that underpinned the reality of the throne, the red rune still glowed. It was buried under layers of dust and grime, hidden behind a panel that it had not been opened since the scouring. It was the talisman of 7 hammers. It was the bomb. Over the millennia, the sensors of the talisman had degraded. The biometric key had corrupted, but the core logic remained. It sat in the darkness, a single unblinking eye, watching the vitals of the Carrion Lord. It listened to the screams of the 10,000 psychers dying in the choir. It felt the tremors of the warp beating against the walls of the webway. It waited. The legacy of Robert Oppenheimer was not the fire he had unleashed in the dawn of the atomic age. It was not the ships he had accelerated or the shields he had raised. His legacy was the silence. It was the 10,000 years of stagnant, terrified silence that held the Imperium together. He had given them a machine they could not understand, a prison they could not open, and a weapon they dared not use. He had become the ghost in the machine, the unrecognized god of the status quo. As the servo skull in the crypt finished its scan and drifted into the darkness, the faint rhythmic thumping of the golden throne continued. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like a clock ticking down. And in the silence of the logic stack, the red rune pulsed once, a tiny, invisible wink of red light that promised, eventually, the end of all things.